Good day to you, and welcome to my ninth talk on the voices of Rhodesian soldiers. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the procedures that were used for cordon and search activities. In the army, it wasn't always the case of patrolling in the bush or setting up ambushes or attacking targets through fire force operations. There was a lot of hard grinding work as well for folk like myself who weren't necessarily involved in fire forces or attacking large camps or whatever. There was a lot of hard slogging on the ground to find information. And one of the ways we achieved this was through cordon and search operations of various villages where people lived either in the rural areas or even in small towns. There are three episodes that I'd like to recall here. Um, Searching the Lukosi mission, which was about 20 kilometers southeast of Wangi, which is now called Hwangi in Zimbabwe. And that was a mission up on a hill overlooking, I think it's the Lukosi River, that joins into the Gwai River further north, which in turn flows into the Zambezi River. It was a well-known fact that the Catholic mission stations of the country were very anti-us, and even on one occasion, when some of my guys were lightly injured and went to get help at a Catholic mission hospital, they were treated very badly. So we were not the flavour of the month with these people, but we'd been worried for some time that they were looking after injured terrorists in their hospital. The station is fairly large, too large to be encompassed in a cordon and search really. So the plan was to use a couple of platoons, which I led, to encircle the southern quarter of the mission station, which is where the hospital and dormitories were, where people slept. The other place that we searched was the African village of Victoria Falls. Once again, quite a large village, far too large to be surrounded in mass. That probably would have taken a couple of companies of soldiers, but we portioned off sections at a time for our very, very early morning cordon and searches. And the cordon and searches weren't necessarily based on information that anyone was in these areas, but we went there to generate the information that we could act on later. And the other one was the Kamativi forest site, where the staff that worked in the Kamativi forest, and that was they were stationed there. They lived in what I would call a compound of maybe 1,000 people, all gathered together in the Kavira forest, which was between Victoria Falls Airport and Zambezi camp, which I've referred to in earlier talks. So we'll start with the Victoria Falls one. The object obviously was to get in there undetected, and to be able to do a reconnaissance, we used a few slimy little tricks. At Victoria Falls, we just drove in there and bought some cokes from the shop, and guys sort of paced around the place so that we could get an idea of the actual physical dimensions on the ground. And we also had a map, of course, that was fairly accurate for the village. And so at about 4 in the morning, a couple of platoons of us based at Victoria Falls in 4 Independent Company, we would drive in there very early, probably arriving at about 5 o'clock in the morning. And that particular cordon was undertaken in summer, so there was sunrise round about 6 o'clock in the morning. And obviously I haven't been able to do a dry run, but based on the dimensions I've taken off from our very rudimentary reconnaissance, and then looking at the map, which was to scale, I figured out how far apart the men should be spaced in to face inwards, and I worked out that I needed two men every 60 meters or so, or 50 meters, which was fine. We could see each other at that distance. We could give supporting fire if anything happened. And so we arrived there. We debussed about 5:05 in the morning, and I started at the lead of a column of about 50 men, and I walked in a big circle, dropping off two men every 40 to 60 meters behind suitable points of cover, and told them to keep their eyes open, to face in towards the houses that we were now surrounding. And within half an hour to 40 minutes, I positioned everybody, and then we would have the police come in and do a fairly thorough search of the houses. And what they were looking for was military-aged men. And if they found military-aged men, they would look at their shoulders to see if they'd had any sort of scuffs and bruises and cuts or depressions in their shoulders from carrying heavy sacks, knapsacks on their backs, rucksacks, which might indicate that they were terrorists. Their hair, most African men like to keep their hair tidy, but if they had very matted hair, that was another indication that the guy was living wild, or a little bit more wilder than normal. And so the police unit would come in, both African and white constables led by a section officer, and they would do a thorough search of all the houses. And in fact, at that particular one, about two stop groups down from where I was, somebody did make a bolt for the bush, and one of the pairs that I dropped off, a guy with a machine gun and the MAG, and his assistant opened fire on him, missed him, and one of the bullets hit a water pipe, so there was water spraying everywhere. I seem to remember there were some SAS guys in the village as well, and one of them walked past and told us we were a bunch of wankers for missing him. But honestly, when you see somebody flitter past at sunrise, you don't always have a good opportunity to hit the person. Anyway, we didn't manage to find that guy. He disappeared into thin air, and we drew a blank on that particular occasion. And then the one in the Kavira forest was really interesting because I was based at Jambezi, which I've mentioned in previous talks, Jambezi Keep, which was a base we had about 44 kilometers east of Victoria Falls. And what we had to do is search the workers' compound, the guys that worked in the teak forest. That area had beautiful teak wood. The trees didn't grow very high, but the wood was exceptionally hard, beautiful. And I have some carvings made from that wood here at my home where I live in England. And you would get wood like ironwood, and the name spells out exactly what type of wood it was. It was absolutely solid, amazing, and you couldn't cut it with a knife if you tried, or you'd have to work bloody hard to get it cut and shaped. I've got one which is a beautiful head of an African man. And patrolling in that forest was dreadful because there were these spider webs with these big spiders, and they had like a yellow web, and the body of the spider its abdomen was enormous, the size of my thumb or bigger, and the legs spreading out, and these things used to position themselves between trees. And because I was the leader on most patrols, I would walk into these things in the dark, straight into my face. It was a horrifying experience, but it was just one of those things that you went through in the military. Anyway, our reconnaissance of the Kavira forest compound, which was about 15 to 20 kilometers west of Jambezi, in other words, halfway back to the road that led to Victoria Falls. A friend of mine, well, he's a friend, but he was a sergeant back then by the name of Michael Kemish. We got into a 4.5, that's a 4.5 tons Mercedes truck, and we drove west in the middle of the day. I had put the odometer readings back to 0, so I knew exactly how far it was from point A to point B, and we drove towards the camp, which was just off that main road, about 200 to 300 meters off this main dirt road between Jambezi and the road to Vic Falls. And we pretended to break down. I was driving the truck, and I brought it to a juddering halt, and then we got out and we opened the bonnet and had a look under there, so that if anybody was looking at us, for all intents and purposes, it was just a couple of guys in an army truck that had broken down. But we used that opportunity to see what the bush looked like around the area, to see how dispersed the houses were, to what extent it was. We obviously couldn't drive around it or walk around it, and I guess maybe a more professional unit would have done a proper reconnaissance, but we just didn't have the time or the facilities to do that, really. And so we had a quick look at the place. We looked at it on the map. Once again, I estimated that 2 platoons of men would be required. So I commanded 4th platoon, and 5th platoon was brought up to us from Victoria Falls. And before we set off the evening before, I did a dummy run of N-busing and D-busing. It's very important when you D-bus at night that guys end up in an orderly manner, where they know who the guy in front of them is and the guy behind them. Otherwise, you can get disorientated and lost if you don't know who's in front of you and who's behind you. So it's good to practice, and I did this several times the evening before, and made sure that the guys were all seated in the same place, that they debussed in the same place, that they ended up in the column in the same place, with strict instructions with the guy second from the back to keep ensuring that the guy right at the back, the tail in Charlie, didn't disappear. And so we now had our order of march. At about 4 in the morning, 3:30, 4 in the morning, we were woken up, had a cup of coffee and a light snack each, and then we in-bussed, got on the 6-vehicle column, and drove the 20-odd kilometers down to the Kavira Forest compound. I had worked out that there was a dip in the road about 3 kilometers from the camp, and when the odometer on the same vehicle I'd used for the reconnaissance hit the required distance, we pulled over to the left, debussed. 2 men remained on each vehicle as escorts, and we lined up, and it was quite a dark night, but no moon, but the stars in Africa are incredible, and so we could walk quite easily along this very finely dusted white sand track road for the 3 kilometers, which just never seemed to end when you're plodding along like that. And the thing that I remember from that really is the way the white road disappeared into the tree line up ahead. It was almost like the tip of a spear going into this black background, and we just plodded along. And I also remember the men's footfalls in the road behind me, in the soil, that patter sort of noise of the men moving silently, and they'd all been checked for equipment that might have rattled, etc. The faces were blackened up. And so we walked the 3 kilometers and reached the T-junction. I turned to the right and went up to the first property or hut, roughly where we'd pretended to break down with our vehicle, and I marched off to the right in a big circle, once again dropping the men off, in this case a little bit closer to each other, perhaps 40 meters, all the way around back to the starting point. It had been This exercise had been coordinated with the armoured cars and a whole lot of police from Victoria Falls and Wankie who would be doing the search through the huts. And the reason why we wanted to search that place is because after contacts in the area, although the Majiba and the cattle would walk over the spoor of the terrorists, the odd track that was picked up always seemed to head in that direction of the camp, and it was long overdue for a search. At about 5:30 or 6 in the morning, just as the sun was coming up, I could hear a column of vehicles coming from the Victoria Falls to Wankie Road from that direction, and then their lights lit up the horizon, and soon they arrived. 2 or 3 Eland armed cars with their 90mm guns and a couple of ferrets, and maybe 2 or 3 vehicles of escorting troops and searchers. And so we stayed around the camp until about 11 or 12 o'clock that day, as the police moved through the compound, and they picked up at the end of the day 4 people of interest, and took them back for further questioning with the SB, etc. And I think, if my memory serves me correctly, that 2 terrorists were actually found in the camp. It was confirmed. The last one I want to talk about is the Lukosi mission. I think it's called the Lukosi mission, which was about 20 kilometers southeast of Wangie. Same procedure, going to do reconnaissance. On that particular occasion, I drove to the camp in a vehicle, took the odometer readings, myself and one other guy, and we actually drove into the mission and just eyeballed the place and figured out which pathways led where to the actual target that we were looking for, which was the hospital and the ward blocks. And so back in Wankie, we had about 2 platoons, possibly 3 platoons sorted out. I was once again leading this. I had a blackboard up on the wall. I drew a map of what the mission station looked like, the orientation to north and south, and the river running past the place, I think was called the Lukosi River. And so I briefed the guys. Once again, we did trial runs of N-busing and D-busing, and we set off at about 4 in the morning, and we got to the exact odometer reading at about 4:30, and then, which was about 3 to 4 kilometers short of the actual mission station. And by the time we'd got there, it was sort of 5 o'clock, 5:30, somewhere around there. The sky was just lightning in the east, and this mission was on a fairly pronounced butt of land with a very steep side on the southeastern side that went down to the riverbed. And so I split the men up into a huge circle. I think one of my sergeants took half of the men off to the left. The map that we had drawn was pretty detailed, and they executed the positioning of the men pretty well. I went down into what would be called a valley below the actual buildings, which I could look up and see them through trees, and they were lit up with light bulbs, the dormitories where the people slept. I could see the hospital, more or less, the gutters, etc. And then, come daylight, an aircraft came over to coordinate things, and the search was just commencing. Well, just before daylight, I was looking up at one of the dormitories up above me, and there was like an archway with a light bulb behind it, and all of a sudden this figure appeared in the window and looked out very hurriedly and jumped through the window and ran off to the right. And We opened fire on the figure. I don't think anything was hit. We didn't hit him because there was so much vegetation in the way that we couldn't actually see him. We were just aiming at our rifles at the footfalls of the guy running through the bushes up ahead, up above us. But I did warn the people on the radio that they were heading in his direction, which was sort of northeast of where I was, and but nothing happened. That guy disappeared, and the search there turned up, I think, one other guy that was taken back for questioning. There's no doubt in my mind that that fellow that jumped through the window was a terrorist. He must have got wind of the searchers coming through the buildings and was forewarned. Like I said, we weren't the flavour of the month with the Catholic priest there or any of his disciples. And they obviously warned this fella and he bolted out the window. But that's just a little snapshot of how we try to gather information. It wasn't all glory and bells and bullets. OPs, we had to do a lot of OPs, observation points, looking into valleys and the ground below us, which the Selous Scouts did a lot of. And so it was important to gather information so that our regular forces could come in with their helicopters and attack base camps that were found. And I will be relating a story about that in my 10th episode. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I look forward to chatting to you again in the future. Thank you.